Ethan didn't think much of it. It was just another quiet evening, the kind where nothing was supposed to happen. He was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone, when he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. Oliver, his cat, his roommate, his self-appointed landlord, was standing on the armrest, claws out, dragging them slowly down the fabric like he was signing his name. "Hey," Ethan said, not even looking up. "Stop that." Oliver stopped, but not because he listened. He turned his head, slow and deliberate, and looked directly at Ethan, and then, like he'd been waiting for exactly this moment, he let out a meow. Not a small one, a loud, indignant, borderline offended meow, like he'd just been personally insulted. Ethan blinked. "Did you just talk back to me?" Oliver didn't answer. He didn't have to. He just held eye contact and did it again, louder this time. What happened next, Ethan still can't fully explain. A simple warning, the kind he'd given 100 times before, somehow turned into a full-blown argument between a grown man and a house cat. "I said stop," Ethan told him, firmer now, sitting up a little straighter, like tone of voice was going to make a difference. Oliver's response was immediate and louder. It wasn't affection, it wasn't confusion. It was defiance, plain and simple, and Ethan was starting to realize he was not going to win this one by talking. He tried anyway. "Oliver, off the couch arm, now." Nothing. Then, almost casually, like he wanted Ethan to see it happen, Oliver reached out one paw and pushed a pillow straight off the couch. It hit the floor with a soft thud. He didn't even flinch. He just kept watching Ethan, waiting to see what he'd do about it. "Don't you dare knock anything else down," Ethan warned. Oliver knocked something else down. That was the moment it clicked for Ethan. This wasn't random. This wasn't a cat being clumsy or curious. Oliver was doing this on purpose, every single time. So Ethan tried something different, a test. He gave one simple command, something Oliver technically knew, something he'd done 1,000 times before without complaint. For a second it actually looked like it might work. Oliver's ears perked. He seemed to consider it, and then he did the exact opposite, slowly, deliberately, like he wanted Ethan to know it was a choice. Ethan sat back, stunned, staring at the small, fluffy creature currently dismantling every ounce of authority he thought he had in his own living room. "You," he said, pointing a finger, "have way too much attitude for a cat." Oliver's answer was one final meow, short, smug, unmistakably satisfied with himself. Then he settled back onto the armrest like nothing had happened at all, like he'd simply been waiting for Ethan to finally understand something obvious. And in that moment, sitting there outnumbered in his own home, Ethan understood exactly what kind of situation he was in. This cat was never going to obey anybody. Not tonight, not tomorrow, maybe not ever. But somewhere underneath the frustration, Ethan couldn't help it. The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. Because as ridiculous as it was, this was only the beginning. By the time evening rolled around, Ethan had made a decision. Enough was enough. If Oliver was going to keep running the house, then at the very least, there needed to be rules, real ones. He sat down on the couch, remote in hand, ready to finally relax after a long day of losing every single battle to a cat. The TV flickered on. For about 10 seconds, everything was peaceful. Then Oliver walked in. He didn't jump onto the couch. He didn't curl up beside Ethan. Instead, he strolled directly in front of the television and sat down, tail wrapped neatly around his paws, blocking the entire screen like he'd planned it that way. "Oliver, move." Nothing. Not even a twitch of an ear. "Move," Ethan repeated, a little sharper this time. Oliver turned his head, looked at him and meowed, loud, unapologetic, like he was the one being inconvenienced. Ethan, for reasons he couldn't fully explain even to himself, decided to meow back. It wasn't his finest moment, but it happened. Oliver did not appreciate the mockery. He responded with an even louder sound, and just like that, the two of them were locked in a full-blown back and forth, man and cat, trading noises across the living room like two roommates arguing over the thermostat. It was ridiculous. Ethan knew it was ridiculous even as he was doing it. Finally, he threw up a hand. "Okay, new rule, effective immediately." He pointed toward the dining room. "You are not allowed on the dining table, ever." Oliver stared at him, silent, unreadable. For a second, Ethan actually believed it had landed. He nodded to himself, satisfied, and got up to grab a glass of water, fully convinced the matter was settled. It was not settled. He'd barely made it to the kitchen when he heard it, a sharp clatter from the dining room. something small hitting the floor. Ethan froze, then rushed back in. And there was Oliver, sitting directly in the center of the dining table, like he'd been invited. Like the rule Ethan had just announced 30 seconds earlier simply didn't apply to him. "I just told you," Ethan started. Oliver looked away, casually, like he'd suddenly become very interested in something on the wall, anything that wasn't Ethan's face. "You know exactly what you did," Ethan said, arms crossed now, standing in the doorway like he was catching a teenager sneaking in past curfew. Oliver said nothing. He simply blinked, slow and unbothered, and gave Ethan the full, unmistakable silent treatment, the kind that somehow felt more insulting than the meowing ever had. Ethan stood there for a long moment, just looking at him, at the empty space where a pillow used to be. At the table he was apparently no longer allowed to enforce rules about. At the small, smug creature currently ignoring him from 6 inches away. Finally he threw his hands up. "Why do I even bother?" Oliver's ears flicked toward him at that. He turned his head, met Ethan's eyes, and let out one final meow, loud, confident, dripping with satisfaction. The kind of sound that needed no translation. He'd won, and he knew it. Ethan let out a long breath and rubbed the back of his neck, staring at the cat who had, in the span of one single day, torn down every rule he'd tried to put in place. He didn't say anything else. There wasn't really anything left to say. Because somewhere between the couch and the kitchen and the dining table, Ethan had come to a quiet, humbling realization. He wasn't in charge here. He never really had been. He had officially, completely, lost control of his own house. By the time night settled in, Ethan was done, completely done. He sank onto the couch, still replaying the day in his head, the argument over the armrest, the empty food bowl, the standoff at the dining table, an entire day of losing to a cat who couldn't even talk. He let his head fall back against the cushion and closed his eyes, too tired to even reach for the remote. That's when he heard it, soft footsteps, familiar ones. Oliver walked into the room, and something about it felt different. There was no dramatic pause, no pointed stare, no meow announcing his arrival. He just walked over, quiet and unbothered, and hopped up onto the couch beside Ethan like it was the most natural thing in the world. Ethan opened one eye and looked at him, suspicious. "What do you want now?" Oliver didn't answer. He didn't demand food. He didn't knock anything over. He didn't even meow. He just sat there, close, still. For once there was no argument to win. Ethan watched him for a moment, waiting for the catch, some trick, some new demand about to surface, but it never came. Oliver simply settled in beside him, tail curled neatly around his paws, looking about as calm as Ethan had ever seen him. Slowly, almost without deciding to, Ethan reached over and started petting him. Oliver's whole body seemed to loosen at the touch. His eyes drifted half shut. The tension that had followed him around all day, the sharp stares, the defiant meows, the little performances, all of it just melted away, replaced by something quieter, something that almost looked like trust. Ethan let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered. But there wasn't any real frustration behind it anymore, just tired affection. He thought about the whole day, the couch, the kitchen, the dining table, and despite every single ridiculous moment, he found himself smiling. Because as much chaos as this cat brought into his life, the truth was, the house wouldn't feel the same without him. It'd just be quiet, empty, boring. "Honestly," Ethan said, glancing down at him, "this place would be pretty dull without you." As if on cue, Oliver opened one eye, sat up slightly, and let out a single dramatic meow, loud, sudden, completely unnecessary. Ethan burst out laughing. There it is, there's the attitude, because of course it hadn't gone anywhere. Of course the peace only lasted so long. That was just who Oliver was. A moment later, without asking permission, Oliver climbed straight onto Ethan's lap and made himself comfortable, settling in like he'd claimed this spot the same way he'd claimed everything else in the house. "Oliver, I have things to do," Ethan said, trying, half-heartedly, to shift him off. Oliver didn't budge, not even a little. He just tucked himself in tighter, clearly not interested in Ethan's schedule. And staring down at him, Ethan finally understood something he probably should have realized a long time ago. He looked toward the camera, shaking his head slightly, a tired but genuine smile on his face. "I thought I adopted a cat," he said. Oliver, right on cue, gave one confident, satisfied meow. Ethan looked back down at him. "But apparently, this cat adopted me." Oliver shifted, stretched, and settled even deeper into Ethan's lap, completely at home, completely in charge, looking every bit like he owned not just the couch, not just the dining table, but the entire house. Ethan just sat there, laughing quietly to himself, too tired and too fond to argue anymore. "Some cats have owners," he said, glancing down at the small furry dictator currently claiming his lap. "But Oliver has a staff,